We started this journey in 2019, and with Wrath of the Lich King Classic confirmed for 2022, it is time for another class retrospective series. During Vanilla we asked, was it any good though? In TBC we moved on to ask, is it any better now? And for Wrath, well, it's no longer a question of asking if your class is good or not, because every spec in the game is great at something. So we're going to be looking at what is new to your class baseline, the PvE talent changes as well as raiding, how well your class is expected to perform in raiding throughout the expansion, PvP performance in the arena, as well as taking a look at your tier sets. And then through this, hopefully we can give a proper answer to your class in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Just how broken is it now? Warlocks were one of the most highly anticipated to perform well classes throughout the duration of TBC, gaining access to highly potent AoE from Seed of Corruption to round out their DPS toolkit, as well as the notorious SL PvP spec, allowing them to control the battlefield and gradually wear their opponents down. And I would say overall that they met those expectations, though whilst performing impressively, the way they did it often left much to be desired. Moving on and upwards into Northrend then, they certainly have a lot to live up to in order to really improve on what they're already capable of, but with a whole host of changes, damage over time effects starting to scale, a plethora of viable specs in all areas of content, and rotational changes so you don't start to fall asleep mid-pull anymore, let's just say they are in a pretty damn good spot. Oh, and yes, before you ask, I am indeed going to main a Warlock in Wrath, so no bias towards the class of course, because they don't need bias to be amazing. Right, so what's changed in your spellbook and what new abilities have we got then? We should begin with your demons because nearly all of them have changed to a certain degree. First up, and this goes for all pets now actually, but Warlock's demon specifically didn't have it in TBC, and that is Avoidance. This means 90% less damage from AoE at all times, meaning your demon doesn't just die to some random spam. Voidwalker's Suffering ability now applies a 10% hit chance debuff, and Sacrifice only costs a small bit of your Voidwalker's health instead of just outright killing it. Also, for some reason, Consume Shadows now greatly increases stealth detection for its duration. The Imp's Fireball has a new animation, not that you're ever going to see it because it's never used, but hey, that's there. For the Suck, Soothing Kiss now applies a 10% attack speed debuff, and if you haven't played WoW in a while, there is also a manly version of it as well. Yes, really. For Fell Hunters, Paranoia and Tainted Blood have been removed from the game, and instead they gain Shadow Bite, which does shadow damage scaling with how many damage over time effects are on the target, and Fell Intelligence, which is just a raid-wide intellect and spirit buff. In the Affliction tree, it's mainly reworks to the whole curse system. Curse of Elements now includes nature damage, which it didn't previously at all. It took them 3 years to implement that. I guess nature just wasn't an element before Wrath of the Lich King or something. Corruption is now instant cast baseline. Curse of Tongues is now only a 30% cast speed increase, down from 60. Drain Mana now does a percentage instead of a flat amount, so you go from never casting it to really never casting it. Curse of Recklessness has been removed from the game. The armor reduction effect it had before has been rolled into Curse of Weakness. And finally, Drained Soul has an execute modifier to do 4 times damage when a target is under 25% health, and can also generate shards during the normal ticks. This spell is the reason Affliction locks get a reputation as a super strong execute class in Wrath. For Demonology, Fire and Spellstones change for the 3rd time in a row in an attempt to get them to be useful outside of providing a magic dispel. Back in Classic they were offhands and they were kind of never used. In TBC they were wands and they were kind of never used. And in Wrath of the Lich King they are now weapon enchants, and yes, they are used, giving extra periodic damage and a nice chunk of spell haste. These will replace your weapon oils, so free stuff, I guess. Nice. Demon Armor now gives bonus healing in addition to armor, and the shadow resistance has gone. Fell Armor now gives spell damage scaling with spirit and a small percentage health heal every few seconds. Ritual of Summoning now creates a portal which functions exactly like a meeting stone, meaning you can summon faster and with less shards. You can now recast Banish to remove the effect, I wish that happened a few years ago, and you can train Dreadsteed at your trainer for a bit of gold instead of having to go and do the entire questline. A new ability for Demonology is Demonic Circle. It's actually 2 abilities, I suppose. You have Demonic Circle Summon and Teleport. The first cast places a circle on the floor that lasts 6 minutes, and then you can teleport and it it will instantly take you back to that location as long as it's within 30 yards. This is, well, as close to a Warlock is to getting any mobility. This is your reposition in PvE to deal with a mechanic where you can set it up in advance. This is your big escape tool in PvP. Super versatile ability and a very welcome addition to the Warlock's toolkit. Finally, in the destruction tree, practically nothing has changed. There's one new ability, Shadow Flame. This is a frontal cone AoE that applies a small damage over time effect. It can be upgraded through glyphing to apply a slow, which is useful in PvP and can also be consumed via conflagrate, as we'll get onto later, giving destruction some stuff they can do without having to hard cast. Those are the baseline changes. Time to take a look at some PvE. So for Warlocks, they have two specializations which should both see a lot of use, and this time around things are going to be very different. Gone are the days of pressing Shadow Bolt as your entire rotation. I mean, you still will be pressing Shadow Bolt, don't you worry about that, just not nearly as much, with both specializations gaining a number of effects to track and snapshotting to consider. Now, snapshotting is one of those things that it's worth talking a little bit more about for Warlocks in particular. Anyone can do it with any spell in the game, but Warlocks damage over time effects do a lot more damage than most people's do, and you have certain ways to extend them beyond their normal duration. The moment when you place the debuff or buff, the game will take a snapshot of some of your buffs and some of the target's debuffs. Certain stats will continue to be applied when the spell is refreshed, whilst others are reset to what your character has at the time of the refresh. We expect, with the game being on patch 3.3.5, to extend buffs such as percentage damage, for example from Tricks of the Trade, as well as crit modifiers such as Mage's Focus Magic, but to not extend things like spell damage effects, as in trinket procs, or haste effects from the likes of Heroism. This kind of stuff can get really min-maxy, but I thought I'd just give it a quick mention here, because I want to take a look at the talent trees. Let's make a start with Affliction. This spec gets mega buffed from TBC to where it's a niche utility spec to arguably being one of the most consistently high DPS specs from day one of Wrath of the Lich King all the way to the very end. Improved Corruption is changed to buff various spells instead of reducing the cast time. Soul Siphon also now works for Drain Soul, which is going to be a big deal when we tally up the total execute on this ability. You could miss putting points into Fell Concentration and have them in Improved Agony and Amplify Curse instead, but Spell Knockback is just super nice to have for general use. Siphon Life has been removed from the game. Now Corruption will instead heal a small amount, as well as certain spells just get a flat buff. Shadow's Embrace has now been reworked, increasing Shadow periodic damage taken and reducing periodic healing. Improved Fell Hunter buffs your pet of choice a little bit so it doesn't go all the time and is a little bit better, though on some fights they may be so short you don't even bother using a Fell Hunter at all. Shadow Mastery is buffed from 10% to 15% bonus damage and now also applies to your Fell Hunter's Shadow Bite. Eradication is brand new to the tree, giving you a 6% chance to get a 20% casting speed after a Corruption tick, which is a pretty huge buff, albeit quite RNG heavy. Malediction is reworked to just buff the power of some of your spells. Death's Embrace is another new talent to give you more execute damage because hey, why not? Pandemic is a massive buff, allowing both Corruption and Unstable Affliction the ability to crit. Everlasting Affliction increases your flat damage by a little bit more and makes it so filler spells refresh Corruption. This talent is why you care about snapshotting Corruption with a high crit and flat damage modifiers active, because you can keep it running forever. And finally, at the bottom of the tree is Haunt, a single target nuke that increases damage over time by a further 20%. You just have this up all the time on your main target. Over in the destruction tree, improved Shadow Bolt has been reworked to apply a 5% spell crit debuff on the target, and the other talents here are just to buff Shadow Bolt's damage, as it's your main filler outside of execute. Overall, Affliction has been buffed super hard. Damage over time effects that crit, the ability to snapshot, very strong single target damage, Fell Hunter's your go-to pet so you have an interrupt, and one of the best execute phases in the entire game with an insane modifier on Drain Soul damage. Affliction locks use glyphs such as Haunt to add a little bit more flat damage, Quick Decay to fish for more Nightfall and Eradication procs, and Life Tap for some flat spell damage gains. But wait, the there's more. Your guild will also want to bring a Demonology Warlock as well. Aside from solid single target damage with good cooldowns and powerful AoE, their unique selling point is a buff called Demonic Pact right at the bottom of the talent tree, which we may as well start with talking about. This makes it so after your demon crits, your entire raid gets 10% of the Warlock's spell damage for 45 seconds. Needless to say, this changes how Demonology is played and geared. You want the largest amount of spell damage you can possibly obtain before you send in your demon to score a crit. And then you don't really want to refresh that buff as it will overwrite the old spell power effect until you really have to, meaning you're going to have to play a pretty macro heavy playstyle if you're really trying to min-max the buff as much as you can, or you just leave your pet on the target all of the time. Either way, you want a demo lock in your raid every single raid. Back at the top of the tree, Fell Synergy means your demon doesn't die to some random AoE anymore as it's constantly being healed. Demonic Brutality buffs your Voidwalker, but now also increases your Fell Guard's attack speed buff. Soul Link has been moved way up the Demonology tree and is now only a 20% damage reduction between you and your demon. More on that in PvP though. Master Conjurer makes your summoning of spell or firestones quite a bit stronger. Mana Feed makes it so your demon never goes but generally speaking mana problems have fixed themselves. Now there's a whole host of raid-wide buffs that solve it. Molten Core is another new talent that makes it so Immolate ticks have a chance to buff either your next 3 Incinerates or Soulfires, which gives you a bit of a mix-up in your rotation. Additionally, Demolocks also get a different Execute rotation as well. And whilst not as powerful as Affliction locks, it makes this spell useful for the first time in PvE since, well, forever, and that spell is Soulfire. Specifically, the Decimation talent changes Soulfire to be spammable on targets on 35% or below. Demonic Sacrifice is finally removed from the game. You know that talent that you had to spend like 20 points in the Demonology tree buffing your demons, only to then end up sacrificing it for a 15% shadow damage buff? Yeah, that one. In fact, if you're a main PvEer, Wrath of the Lich King will be the first time you're actually going to have to use a demon in raids. And I'm borderline not even counting Imp because it would just auto die if you ever tried to actually use it for combat. Anyways, instead there is now Demonic Empowerment, which, well, just empowers your current demon in a variety of ways. You'll be using it on your Felguard for the attack speed buff though. Improved Demonic Tactics now gives your demon a bit of extra crit, and Nemesis reduces the cooldown on all of your big spells by a huge 30%. And finally, at the bottom of the tree has to be one of the most iconic Warlock spells ever that Blizzard totally stole from Warlocks and gave to demon hunters. Anyways, at least in Wrath, you get to have Metamorphosis. Transform into a powerful demon for 30 seconds, gaining a substantial amount of offensive and defensive stats, as well as gaining several new abilities such as a charge, a cleave, an AoE taunt, and most importantly, an immolation aura. This is your big cooldown, your burst window, and the reason Demonology lock AoE is so powerful. Glyph-wise, Demonology locks are quite similar to Affliction, also wanting quick decay and life tap, but opting for Felguard for more damage on that demon. With the talent trees and baseline changes out of the way then, how do we reckon the Warlock is going to perform throughout the duration of the expansion? Well, no surprise to say, pretty damn well. Affliction is full on expected to be one of the most consistently high DPS classes from day one to the end of the expansion. There will be fights where people beat them out with cleave damage, they will be outscaled eventually in ICC by the likes of warriors, mages and rogues, but they are just always up there in terms of performance. If you enjoy a damage over time playstyle and seeing a big execute phase, it's hard not to recommend picking up an Affliction. Also, they are one of the few DPS we expect to be stacked in raids where you're aiming to push performance a little bit more, so they should be in pretty high demand despite being a DPS class. However, let's just say the fan server side of things have a habit of buffing content, and as things stand at the moment, we are not getting buffed content in WotLK Classic, or even pre-nerf content for that matter. This means bosses, ads and so on are just going to have way less health. Less health means less execute, and less execute uptimes means less damage for the Affliction lock, who really benefits from a prolonged period of time here. Demonology Warlocks fill that utility role and are largely seen as a you need one but only ever one type of spec. Yet early on in the expansion, they do kind of pop off DPS wise. Demolocks love a short fight, and early in tier 7, fights are gonna be short. This is so they can maximize their uptime on meta and heroism. Many raids will seek to prioritize caster gear to the Demolock, as an upgrade for them directly translates to a buff for every single other class that cares about spell damage. It's kind of like how the Survival Hunter was in TBC, but even better. We expect Demolocks to fall off in DPS when compared to Affliction over the course of the expansion as they don't scale quite as well, but they're still very much wanted. Both specializations have tracking damage over time, they care about procs, they care about snapshotting, and have a different execute phase. I think it comes down to how much you care about your own DPS as opposed to playing what is more of a supportive role. So in PvE, things are looking good for Warlocks. How is PvP then? Yeah, it's also very good. Once again, there are two fully viable specs, both of which play completely differently and fit into different comps, which is the kind of flexibility not many pure DPS classes have. For Warlocks, they can either play Affliction in PvP or Destruction. Now, off the back of talking about Affliction in PvE, let's cover that again. There's not a huge amount of other changes which we haven't already mentioned. Of course, you pick up improved Howl of Terror to make that an instant cast, and over in the Demonology tree, now that Soul Link is way further up in the tree, you're always going to be getting that. You'll also pick up Fell Domination and Master Summoner, so you can get your second pet out near instantly after your first one dies, which you will certainly want to do because Warlocks are way more squishy in Wrath. Improved Fear is another new talent that applies a brief slow after the effect ends, and Curse of Exhaustion is of course taken in PvP to give you that little bit of extra utility. Glyph-wise, Quick Decay is taken once again on top of Corruption, which doubles the effect of Nightfall, and Shadow Flame, which applies a pretty big 70% slow on top of its damage over time effect. Affliction locks in Wrath Arena, play that classic multi-dot high pressure playstyle. Unstable Affliction applies a huge risk of trying to dispel your other periodic effects, and between that you're trying to play around pillars, kiting, throwing out utility curses, and if Drained Soul ever ticks on something under 25% health, it's gonna hurt them real bad. Affliction locks often pair up with other dot focus classes such as Shadow Priests or Unholy DKs. What we haven't talked about at all so far is Destruction, so I guess this is really the big change for the Warlock in Wrath the Lich King. This spec has always been the Shadow Bolt throwing PvE spec since vanilla. Now it's entirely different, focusing much more around fire damage and dealing devastating burst damage that can remove entire health bars in a single global. The Demonology tree is quite standard and pretty much the same as when we looked at the Affliction tree a moment ago, though Destruction in battlegrounds or maybe more skirmish smaller scale fights could consider using a Succubus and specking into improving it in the Demonology tree, which makes the juice about a 0.5 second cast. For the most part though, you'll just use Fell Hunter, it's too good. The Destruction tree has a ton of changes to amp up the power of this spec. Molten Skin is just a flat 6% damage reduction now. Aftermath increases the damage of your Immolate and adds a guaranteed slow to conflagration. Now the protection has been reworked to now be a 30% chance to gain a 30% damage reduction against any spell school that hits you. Conflag now deals some of its damage instantly and then a dot effect afterwards. It can also be consumed by Shadow Flame if you need to. The Pyroclasm talent has been reworked, but it's not taken here. It's a decent damage increase, but not from spells you'll be casting too much. Backdraft is new and is such an important talent for your entire burst toolkit. Following a conflag, your GCD and casting time of your next 3 destruction spells is reduced by 30%. The uptime on this is also really good due to conflag having a super short cooldown. Add a heroism on top of this and Destrolocks can send a good 3 spells in the air towards someone before they even know what's hit them. Shadow Fury has had its cast removed, nothing really to add on that, great quality of life change. Empowered Imp is actually such a good talent, and I think it was intended for PvE destruction because unfortunately your Imp is just way too fragile to use in PvP. Fire and Brimstone just adds a bunch more damage against targets with Immolate and some extra crit chance. And the final talent, another iconic, I know I say this word a lot, but it totally is. Wrath is full of talents that have become the centerpiece of class identity. Anyways, another iconic talent, Chaos Bolt. Though in Wrath it probably works differently from how you remember. In recent expansions it's just been a 100% crit chance nuke. That is not the case here. Instead it cannot be resisted and pierces through all absorption effects. Cloak of Shadows on the rogue? No problem. Power Word Shield active? Doesn't matter. Chaos Bolt is one of the ultimate big satisfying single target nuke spells. Did I even mention it looks awesome as well? Destruction uses glyphs like Shadow Flame, Immolate to boost their damage, and Conflagrate so you don't have to constantly be reapplying Immolate. Destrolocks are most often found in comps where they want to land some cross CC and then remove somebody from existence, often alongside Elemental Shamans or Frost Mages. Let's finish up on some tier sets that the Warlock gets access to. Tier 7, the Plague Heart Garb. It's solid on appearance as per the usual with a tier 3 copy paste. The 2 set makes Corruption and Immolate have a chance to increase the crit chance of your next Shadow Bolt or Incinerate by 10% for 10 seconds. So I had to go and have a look at the proc chance, and apparently it's 15%, so yeah, not exactly great. The 4 set makes casting Life Tap give you 300 spirit for 10 seconds. This looks like a meme, but is actually really good. Glyph of Life Tap already means spirit is bonus spell power, and Fell Armor also turns spirit into spell power, so it's just a lot of free bonus spell power. Tier 8 is the Deathbringer Garb from Ulduar. This set will always stand out as the one that's used in the Wrathgate cinematic and looks really cool. The 2 set is 20% extra damage from Unstable Affliction and 10% more from Immolate, which is not half bad. The 4 set is 5% more crit on Shadow Bolt and Incinerate. Again, it's functional, but just not very exciting. Tier 9 from Trial of the Crusader is either Gul'dan or Kel'Thuzad's Regalia. The 2 set is 10% more crits from your pet, and the 4 set is 10% more damage on a bunch of your dots. Again, it will scale well with more gear becoming available, but it's not much of a game changer, nothing to really say here. Tier 10 from ICC is the Dark Coven's Regalia. I have to say it looks good, but not quite as good as the Ulduar set did. 2 set is 5% more crit on a bunch more spells, and the 4 set is probably the only interesting tier locks get this expansion from a gameplay perspective, where dot ticks have a chance to give you 10% more damage for 10 seconds, which can impact things such as snapshotting or just general cooldown usage. So with all that said, now we've checked out the changes to the talents, PvE, PvP and everything in between, can we give an answer to Warlock in Wrath of the Lich King Classic? How broken is it now? Somehow this class goes from being pretty top tier at everything in TBC to even more top tier at everything in Wrath of the Lich King. Warlock is a class you will see represented across all raiding content and arenas. It's got multiple viable specs in PvP and PvE content, a wide range of utility, more interesting rotations, pretty much all the jank from TBC has been worked out and left us with a class in a really strong state. Look, I know I'm saying this as a Warlock player, but I would have rolled them anyway. I just like the class. It certainly helps though when they're in a super good spot for the expansion. And that's about everything I have to say about the Warlock. Let me know if you're thinking of giving it a go or whether you played it back in the day. As always guys, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you all in the next one very soon.